So we'll get started. So hello, members. My name is Kathleen McMacken. I'm the membership manager here at the Henry Ford, and I'm extraordinarily excited to welcome you to the first ever Member Appreciation Days virtual program. This talk is part of the Henry Ford's virtual series, THF Conversations, where we feature leaders in their fields discussing topics and trends relevant to the world we live in today. These special opportunities are hosted and curated by the Henry Ford's experts and held live on Zoom. So if you enjoy today's program, stay tuned for more of THF Conversations, including some editions created especially for you and our member community. Today's talk is about the next building coming to Greenfield Village, the vegetable building from Detroit's former Central Market. And we are incredibly fortunate that it's being presented by our own curator of agriculture and the environment, Deborah Reed. Deb loves a research challenge. She loves the sense of fulfillment that comes from a fruitful day in the archives, and she loves to share what she's found with others. And during the pandemic, her exploration has included deep dives into digitized historic newspapers and into journals of Detroit's former Common Council meeting minutes. She's been eagerly awaiting this occasion to share recent findings about the vendors who sustained the local food environment in Detroit nearly 150 years ago. So during the program, please submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And lastly, just before we get started, to our members, thank you again for your continued support of the Henry Ford. I hope you know how deeply, deeply grateful we are that you join us in our commitment to preserving the past and fueling the future. So now I will hand it over to Deb to take us back to the 19th century and introduce us to a few of the characters who brought the vegetable building to life.
That's great. Thank you, Kat, and thank you, Charisma, for managing this this project, meaning THF Conversations. And it'll take just a second to make sure we have the full screen. So today we're talking about vendors in Detroit's vegetable building, and the topic relates to a community of entrepreneurship and a local food environment. So for those of you who may not know me, there I am. This is last summer at Firestone in the context of filming Innovation Nation. And on the other side is our sort of outline. So we're going to talk about what a community of entrepreneurship means and what a local food environment means in language today. And then we're going to shift to looking at some of the individuals who were the vendors, the entrepreneurs active in the market between the 1861 and 1893 time period. They exist because of their ability to sell directly to customers, and customers therefore factor in as critically to a community of entrepreneurship as does the vendors, the hucksters, nurserymen, fishmongers, and confectioners. And ultimately, these authentic stories are going to help bridge the gap between these historic characters you'll learn about today and current issues of food security. So the center of Detroit's local food scene 160 years ago was a public market that was located between Bates and Randolph Streets and behind City Hall on Campus Martius. This is that vegetable building constructed and opened in 1861 as it appeared in 1888. The new building was nearly as big as a football field, and it opened for business April 1861. Rest assured, this was an ever-changing environment, and it's frozen in time only because of this photograph. Within this building and around it, the near vicinity, a community existed. The Common Council of the City of Detroit really built the community and by building the building, and they made decisions about the maintenance of the building and the upkeep of the building. They hired a clerk of markets to manage the building, and that space became a place where the vendors and the customers dickered over the price of whatever it is the vendor, the entrepreneur, was selling. So then you might wonder, well, what constitutes entrepreneurship? And today we know that there are 4 types of entrepreneurship. There are small businesses, scalable startups, large companies, and social entrepreneurs. Each of them engages in entrepreneurship in that they combine resources in ways that result in a market value that's greater than the resources generated elsewhere, either individually or in combination. And ultimately, entrepreneurs profit, in quotes, but the profit differs depending upon the goal of the entrepreneur. So others before me have sifted through documents since the Henry Ford acquired this building in 2003. And on the screen is a smattering of some of the things: the Detroit City directories, the Common Council meeting minutes, US population census manuscripts, newspapers, local histories. There's a death certificate, the guide map for Detroit. There's additional photographic evidence within Henry Ford and within the Burton Historical Collection at the Detroit Public Library and at the Detroit Historical Society. These resources are easily accessible, and we can all learn together about who these individuals were. But today what I want to do is provide a text-heavy approach to getting to know some of these vendors better. These vendors are sole proprietors predominantly. Their resources were vegetables and fruit, the flowers that they raised, the fish that they caught, the fresh meat that they butchered. Also, peddlers who sold Yankee trinkets, as the directories of the time called them, and who sold services like whitewashing to customers. Records indicate, though, that in addition to this cash-based economy, central markets sustained community-based entrepreneurship too. So in other words, it functioned as a social safety net of sorts for the friendless, the homeless, the newcomer. Those services had they cost money, but they had no price tag. And ultimately, the customer sustained the local food environment. So after we talk about the vendors today, we'll spend a little time talking about customers too. Now, there's a lot to explore. So this image on the left is the 3-story market building. So if you look to the image on the left and you look to the right in that image, there's a 3-story market building with a spire. That is the Central Market Building, constructed in 1882. Campus Martius, well, you see the Soldiers Memorial in Campus Martius in downtown Detroit. What we can't see behind the Central Market Building is the vegetable building. And quite literally, we have to dig deep to figure out what goes on literally behind this view. And the image on the right shows a detail from an 1888 to 1890 photo of the market. So you get a sense of the busyness of it and the congestion of it, which is good for business. Now, a little further afield though, to give you a sense that Detroit is not unique, this is a market in Quebec. It may very well be in Montreal, but I use it far away in a different country to simply indicate that governments, urban governments especially, were obligated to support the health and the well-being of their residents. And they did so by establishing and maintaining these public markets. It's important to note that these public markets, these city markets, are different than farmers markets. Farmers markets are really markets that exist because farmers form a corporation. They are the owner-operators of that business through which they sell. These public markets did not operate that way. They were created by cities, funded through tax dollars, managed by cities, and vendors paid stall rent. I know these are small, bear with me. Practicality dictated that the market be in the center of downtown Detroit. So the image on the left shows, you can see the river at the bottom. If you go straight up the middle, you'll see the cross street. Just to the right, right in the middle, is basically a rectangle, which was the location of the Detroit City Hall. And behind it, this open space. And in that space was where the market clustered. In 1843, a vegetable shed is constructed at the rear of City Hall, basically a roof supported by posts. This heavily trafficked area, though, exceeded the dimensions of that rapidly. In 1849, the city builds another brick building closer to the City Hall, right behind it, and that previous vegetable shed. And they add to that brick building. It's, in fact, enclosed. By 1860, there's a comment on the part of the city officials, these common council members, that there are vendors who have rented and occupied those buildings for a long time, some of whom have stood at the same stand for nearly 20 years. Those vendors feel a sense of unease and some concern about the city's plan when they decide they need to build a new vegetable building. Basically, they have to cover this open market. Who do they get to do it? The fella at the top of your screen is John Shaffer. There's his advertisement as an architect, engineer, draftsman, and designer. He was an immigrant from Bavaria. He was very eager to make a difference in Detroit architecture. I'm not going to go into details about John Shaffer. We can do that another day. But what's important is the concern that the city had to keep the public secure where they bought and sold their essential food items. And they adopt this plan that John Shaffer proposes. Quick aside, the reason we don't hear a lot more about John Shaffer, from what I have been able to figure out, he dies falling off a roof in 1870 on a structure he was in the process of constructing at his new home in Grosse Pointe. So that accident may have ended a career, but there's a lot more to learn about him. Today, though, we're talking about the vendors. So the mayor praises the building for its abundant and comfortable accommodations for those buying and selling vegetables and other market wares. And that's the quote that's highlighted here from this 1862 Detroit Common Council Journal. And the structure cost $5,997. In this building, the city expected vendors to sell fresh fish, poultry, eggs, butter, fruits, and vegetables of any kind. To do so, they have to standardize the rent. So I know there's a lot of words on this screen, but I thought it would be easier to do this. On the left are the different categories of stands. So this upper vegetable market is that enclosed brick building that was situated right behind what is basically one of the old city halls. The city hall is quickly torn down. That upper vegetable market stand, the enclosed brick building, is ultimately torn down. And in the place of both of those goes that new central market 3-story building that we saw in one of those earlier images. The next three rows discuss the different rates within the vegetable building itself. in 1860, $2 a month for anyone who wants to have a fish stand. And those fish stands would only be located on the north side of the building. And you can see then over time, within a decade, that doubled to $4. And within another decade, it doubled for corners to $8 a month and middle stands to $6 a month. Then there are other stands within the vegetable building that have a higher rate of $2 a month. And then you can see, I'm not going to go into the details, but how the rent changes for different places, different corners, which side of the building you're on in the next 20 years of its operation. I'm still trying to figure out which stands sat at which corners of the building. That's essential so that we can accurately program for who was in what stand when it's actually reconstructed in Greenfield Village. At the bottom is interesting detail about the hawkers and the peddlers. So, and it's a bit cut off, but suffice to say that if you were on foot, a person who was a hawker or a peddler paid $5 for a license. And on foot means you're walking, but you might have had a hand cart. $10 was the license for a person with, quote, one horse or other beast of burden, an ox, a steer, a horse, or a mule. And then it was $15 for a license for any vehicle or carriage drawn by more than one horse or animal. And that was as specified in the 1860-61 city ordinance. This was a business. The city justified the expense for their building based on projected rent, and it was factored out, I should say in detail. So who are some of these vendors? This is a easily accessible image. We have it on the website as a digitized asset, but you can search Google, search the Happy Trust and find the history of Detroit and Michigan by Silas Farmer. And this image is in it, as is a nice little history of the markets in Detroit. The original photograph from which this lithograph was made is also in a stereograph view at the Burton collection in the Detroit Public Library's Silas Farmer collection. So if you want to see it, you could Google that. But this gives us wonderful detail when you imagine what it will look like when it's reconstructed in Greenfield Village, right down to how they ran rope, hung canvases to try to get extra shade, maybe at different times of the day as the sun moved. In front of the entrance, those look a lot like chicken coops to me, so mobile wooden containers that held live birds. And then to the right is a little kiosk, freestanding apparently, and little structures like that were constructed around the building by folks who might have a pop-up of some sort. They also had to pay sometimes a stall rent, because the city council minutes would indicate that so-and-so petitioned for the ability to pay a rent for a stall for such a separated structure. So I mentioned it was a constant motion, and there were often exceptions that had to be made to those rules that we just looked at in terms of rent rates and locations. And colorful characters. So this oyster hawker is a neat stereograph to give us a sense of the kinds of pop-up furniture, sawhorses and a flat board. The girl in this image may have stood out among a crowd of oyster shuckers at a typical East Coast urban market, luring customers to her stand where folks could try her, quote, native oysters from nearby banks. There's more detail to this, but those oysters were coast specific. But the 1850s newspapers regularly advertised oysters for sale. And I wanted to find an oyster shucker in the city directories that worked out of Central Market. Well, I didn't find such a thing, but there's good reason for that. Oysters are seasonal. They are not harvested between well, with months with an R, basically. So their season picks up in, get my years right, their seasons pick up after August, so September through April. They are not harvested May through August. Well, an April through October, so the seasons that they are harvested, which is September through April, is out of touch with the seasonal nature of Central Market. I hope I didn't lose you there. But during the season, it was common in the newspapers for folks to say that so-and-so had oysters, wholesale or retail, and you could also find their agents at the market. So such pop-up oyster stands would have been common in those months of September, October, and even perhaps into November and December, when technically the market was closed, but sometimes there were special situations or special allowances made. And thinking about these oysters gets you also to think about fish markets. We don't have a comparable illustration of the interior of our Central Market, but this is the Paris Central Market, as in Paris, France, and the fishwives at that market. This was a much larger structure, but it was comparable in that it had cast iron columns, as the Detroit Central Market had, and gas lights. The Detroit Central Market had 6 gas lights installed when it was originally constructed. And you can just imagine those fish dealers on that north wall with a gas light. So a little bit more about fish. I thought, and learned otherwise, that there would be a vibrant fish market in Detroit. I looked at the names of folks on your screen to the right, listed in the city directories, and there they are, name after name. Many of them, not most, but many are available for additional research through the US population census. But in fact, reading more about it, dealers say Detroit is the poorest fish market in the country, not just the Midwest, in the country. Why? And the dealer there, where the blue line or blue arrow points, says that it's his opinion that Detroit residents fish, so they don't have to rely on fish stands. And yet you can see there were a lot of fish mongers making a living, or at least selling directly to customers through stalls at Central Market. Probably the folks with the biggest reputation within the market were the butchers. Now, that's, I need to qualify that. The butchers were predominantly in that structure that was enclosed brick, so not in the open-sided vegetable building. But the butchers then occupied floors in that 3-story Central Market building. And without going into detail, suffice to say that the butchers are organized and influential. Some butchers are elected to the city common council, and they have strong ethnic identities. They even fielded a baseball team, apparently. So there's lots more to learn about these butchers, and we have names to help us do that. Newspaper reports regularly mention the tensions between the butchers and the fishmongers. Obviously, not all vendors agreed. So here's a rotund and rosy dealer of butter, cheese, and eggs who thinks that this market is good enough for me. I'm not very sickly, in contrast to the candy dealer who thinks it's the worst space possible, too cold in the winter and full of dust. No place to sell candy. The people for which the structure really existed were these greengrocers and market hucksters. And what I thought I'd do in the next couple of slides is look a little bit more detail into some folks that we might not often think of. Anywhere from about 25% to 40% of the greengrocers and market hucksters were women. And I just point out Nancy Martin here, who was 60 years old and living with a man named Walter Harper, who was 70, next to the McSweeneys. The McSweeneys was a large market gardening family, and there was a 60-year-old McSweeney woman, and you can see Ann McSweeney there just above Nancy Martin, and you can just see the two of these folks, neighbors in gardening, and then neighbors in the market. And that kind of extended family network, for lack of a better word, is maybe not uncommon. It just takes a while to document. And then James Moding, spelled in all these different variations in different city directories and censuses, is identified as African-American man. But when you track him, he persists for 15 years at different addresses. Sometimes it's stall 19 in the city hall or then Central Market. Sometimes it's stall 4, but selling his market wares. And then there's also this conflict that arises among perceptions of these greengrocers and market hucksters. And the little quote there in the center bottom talks about how a lady, basically ladies aren't safe. A lady who drives downtown to do her own marketing can't come up to the market building without danger of having her carriage smashed by these stupid country hucksters who are accustomed to having a 10-acre lot to turn around in. Well, that's according to the Free Press in December 1886. Then there was a different echelon, I guess you could say, of nurserymen. And I use a name familiar, but a name, John Ford is not, as I can figure, related in any way to the other Ford family from whom Henry descends. John Ford was an alderman in the 9th Ward. His operation was on Michigan near LaFontaine. And he and his sons operated, with seasonal vegetables and trees, fruit trees, berry shrubs, flowers. These nurserymen plus the butchers, more or less, you could say, they were the power at the tip of the vendor hierarchy, with the majority of folks being those market gardeners and truck farmers. There were also fruit dealers, and Louis Shiat, I guess this is Shiat, pardon me. Well, I cannot pronounce it, and I have practiced, and someone can correct me, correct my pronunciation. Considered the first outdoor fruit merchant in Detroit. He was Italian. And in an 1890 newspaper, the Free Press, there's an illustration of a vegetable fruit dealer and a harangue of sorts about the ways that these pop-up fruit stands, and I think of Mr. Shiap Casa as being one of these pop-up fruit vendors, but with a very specific location and consistency. But they considered that these pop-up fruit vendors monopolize the public streets. And as they go on about the southeast corner of Jefferson and Woodward Avenues, a stand kept by an Italian who could certainly afford to rent a store. He came to Detroit several years ago and has kept a fruit stand ever since. And he's made money because he paid comparatively little rent, and it goes on in this vein. Very much a symptom or a symbol of anti-immigrant sentiments within the context of the market setting of Detroit's local food economy. So a little bit afield from foodstuffs are whitewashers. So I highlight two Black men. This is Robert Johnson, Jackson, mentioned as Rob Jackson in the 1860 population census, a whitewasher who lived at 192 Congress East, and then perhaps brought a hand truck, basically rented his services out for the day, would go to wherever the person hired him and return the next market day to continue to sell his wares. There's a fantastic photograph in the Burton collection of a Black man who is identified as a whitewasher. Whether he was one or the other of these men is impossible to say, sadly. But James King is another one of as many as 440 in 1870 people of color identified in the city of Detroit, many of whom were, or not many of whom, but significant numbers of whom had a public space within this market. And so a little bit closer to the ground, quite literally, here's the map. And we get to talk a little bit about Mary Judge. Mary Judge is perhaps the best known of the vendors because she persists in the Central Market context from if not 1860, when it's being constructed, immediately thereafter. She's considered one of the people that had special dispensation to maintain a stall in the market. And even though she lived in an alley, she was consistently listed in the city directories selling all manner of things, including vegetables, but not exclusively vegetables. In one census, her address was listed as an alley near 98 Brush Street. So that's the red line there. And she had a lifelong affinity to the Catholic Church, ultimately constructed where you see the St. Anne's Catholic Asylum and St. Anne's Catholic Church located. So that gives you a sense of the landscape as of 1878. So now very quickly, I want to go through a little bit of information about some folks who were customers, and you may see some familiar names here. So first off, the Friends of the Homeless. There's there's the Friends of the Homeless structure. And then to the lower right is this statement that the proprietors of the meat and vegetable stalls at Central Market have been generous contributors since 1862. They've filled the, quote, home basket every Wednesday and Saturday when brought by boys from the home. So you get a sense that retail sales occurred on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and there was this social safety net that vendors provided to at least the boys from the home of the friendless. This home is a safety net for folks around and about the market. The census page here, I excerpted a few lines that show some of the prostitutes that live on Bates Street, veritably across from the market. Without calling out names, it's these kinds of individuals that Friends of the Homeless helped, and the home of the friendless existed to support. So there's those kinds of detailed stories that can be touched upon with the market, the fabulous multi-layered market. A building, yes, to represent the wife of the architect, probably Catherine Bauer, B-O-E-R or B-A-U-E-R, Shaffer, came to the market. The family lived not far away until they moved to Grosse Pointe. And as the wife of the architect, you can only imagine her dragging her ultimately 5 children by the time he dies to roam around the stalls of the building that he constructed. She was of French descent. And then, drum roll please, thank you, Cindy Malati, who had a rainy Saturday and was able to sit with the addresses in the Ford Home interpretive manual and come up with a list of addresses that Clara and Henry lived and plot them. And I know this took longer than that rainy afternoon, but the arrows show the locations, and if you can see the numbers, of the home on John, Washington, and Cass. And the blue star, blue star, green star is the market location. And then the Edison Illuminating Company location, you can see where that is with the sunlight in the middle. So Mark Gruther and I have talked. It is very difficult to say with any certainty that Clara absolutely shopped there, but it is highly likely that she shopped there. It was within easy walking distance. It would have been one of those destinations for her. And between 1891 and 1892, those last 2 years of full operation, before Eastern Market opened, it would have been a go-to location to satisfy her perishable food needs and fresh meat and vegetables. It could have been that she and Henry even knew some of the vendors, and this is where continued research is required. And last but not least, among the customers, and I am going to wrap this up very quickly, is Richard Barry Harrison, who none of you may have heard of, but he was born in Canada. He came to Detroit to run the bells at the Russell House. And you see the Russell House over there in the photograph to the building to the right of that 3-story Central Market building. He earned tips. Often folks gave him tickets to the opera and to the theater. He also studied theater. He dedicates himself to elocution. He eventually meets Paul Laurence Dunbar and launches into a career touring and basically presenting memorized drama. Why is his name perhaps familiar? In 1930, a play called The Green Pastures received the Pulitzer for drama. And Richard Barry Harrison played the Lord in what was the first all-Black cast on Broadway. And he came into his own running back and forth and through this location. Those are the kinds of stories that we will be able to share when the building is reconstructed within Greenfield Village. It's almost overwhelming, the range of possibilities. I leave you with these few images. We had prepared this year with the help of Creative Services, a little handout, double-sided, of a tomato trade card or a seed packet with some information about Central Market and some flowers to remind us that flowers and vegetables will be available literally and figuratively when the structure is recreated. I also want to just hint that there's a lot of connections throughout the village with the market. So the Ford home, Ford had 400 apple trees. Where do those apples go? But to maybe wholesale markets. He probably sold wood. That would have been at the Eastern Wood Market. And he definitely sold hay, which would have happened at the Western Hay Market, the Eastern Wood Market. So we have lots more details to ferret out. And I'm going to leave you with a few beautiful images of the historic garden at Ford Home, the orchard, the fields at Firestone. The Firestones were not market gardeners, but these immersive landscapes provide opportunities to help folks understand the kinds of farm fields that grew the vegetables that the vendors sold in the market. Oh, and there's honey, but that's for another story too. Thank you. I'm sorry I went a little long, but I appreciate your coming, and I look forward to hearing questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Deb, for sharing your findings with us. Thank you for this extraordinary presentation about this next experience coming into the village. So we do have some time for a few questions, and we have a number that have come in from our members so far. So we'll get started with one from Ron. He says, I didn't realize that Greenfield Village was still adding buildings. Is there a limit to the number of buildings that can be added?
Time and money. I cannot speak with any authority, but as the interpretive opportunities and financial resources arise, so yeah, maybe. Stay tuned. But this is the most recent since the roundhouse reconstruction.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Amy, and she asks, what's a good source for lists of vendors at the market, like city directories? And she says, I have a lot of farmers in my family tree, so now I'm curious whether any of them were vendors at the market.
Reach out. We'd love to help you figure that out. There was a project in 2006, a contract to research, and so a person, Leslie Mayo, went through and documented, based on reading through city directories, who in a given year was in the City Hall market or the Central Market and what their stall number was. So we have that compiled already. It's simply like a census or an inventory of who was there. Some of the city directories are available via Hathi Trust, and that's HATHITRUS as in Sam T. .org, I believe. And it's the world's library, so accessible for research, and you could pull up a city directory. These are also available via Google Books and sometimes simply on the internet. And in our very own BFRC when it reopens for, consistently reopens. But you quite literally sit there and flip through pages. The advertisers, the trades were consolidated in the back usually. So you'd have that list of fish dealers or the list of garden hucksters. And then there's separate section that is simply the name of each person in alphabetical order. So there's lots of sources to perhaps find that family member, but we'd be very happy to answer a research query about that too.
And next we have a question from Janice, who asks, how will the reconstructed market building be used in Greenfield Village?
We have a month-by-month dream that includes being an event space. So when Motor Muster or Halloween holiday nights, there'd be an aspect of those large events in the structure. And as well as daily programming, perhaps dramatic presentations. This is something that the Greenfield Village program experts will help develop, and it's a work in progress, but we already have a lot of good ideas, and it's this kind of research that helps, you could say, put the flesh on the bones of who those historic persons will be.
And then we have kind of a couple of questions in the Q&A feature that are asking about timeline and when this experience will be available in the village. So maybe we can kind of combine all those into one. And Deb, what do you think?
Yes, that eternal question, how long will it take? So the structure has been, in parts, has been well cared for since 2003 when they came to the museum from the city. The dream was that it would open April of 19, pardon me, wrong century, 2021, which would have been the 160th anniversary of its opening. We still hope that it may open in 2021, but there have been a couple of very strategic delays to ensure the historic integrity of the structure. So stay tuned, because we're going to keep you informed about the progress.
And there have also been a couple of questions that have come through asking about the location, where in the village the market will be once it's all fully activated. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. So just as it was downtown Detroit, near the Edison Illuminating Plant and south of Smith Creek Depot, in that area where the skating rink, if you recall from Holiday Nights, was located. In fact, if you come to Greenfield Village, you can see the area already boarded off. There's a fence around it with a coming soon and Detroit Farmers Market on the sign.
Absolutely. So now a couple more questions about some of the characters who worked in the market. One, would farmers from Windsor sell their produce at the market?
Yes, that's the short answer. It was especially common earlier. So because the river was like it was readily traversed. You just got on a boat and rowed across. So there was a lot of exchange back and forth. And the market, the hucksters, so the hucksters is the term for market gardener. Hucksters from Windsor often were revered for the fine fruits and vegetables that they brought to the market. I have yet to document a huckster or other vendor from Windsor in the specific time frame. Why? Because they may not show up in the city directory. So we're trying to figure that out, but absolutely, yes, there were people who would vend in Detroit who lived in Windsor.
And thank you for the clarification on hucksters. Another kind of clarification question came in asking, what is a whitewasher? What does that person do?
Yes, so whitewashers are painters, basically, but they tended to paint interiors, and you whitewash an interior to make the walls white in an era before electric lights, when the whiteness of the walls reflected light and brightened interiors. Whitewashers often painted basements because you just need that extra level of light. Cellars, factory interiors, the interiors of barns and dairies and outhouses. So it was menial labor, but they would mix the lime with the water and prepare their own paints and paint their interiors.
Excellent, thank you. Next question from Kathleen. She asks, how much of the original market structure remains, which I recall had been used for the stables on Belle Isle, or is this reconstruction all new based on those pieces?
Yes, so that's a perfect question. It was a remarkable survival rate for the columns and the wooden frame members. So there were 48 cast iron columns. Long story short, due to fire, there was a fire in 1876 in the building and some other damage. There were replacement columns made during its 30-year history downtown Detroit. but there are still many intact columns and fragments of same. And a lot of the original yellow pine wood framing above the columns and for the roof structure survives. There are photographs that you can search through if you go to the Henry Ford website and you look in digital collections. Jim McCabe, who worked with the structure as they dismantled it, took a lot of photographs. And it's wonderful to see the structure as it looked at Belle Isle and then as it was deconstructed. The question is, how much of the original structure can be in the reconstruction? And that partially relates to code. So this is where the experts in facilities and contractors and structural engineers, they're currently working to determine just how much of the original, but it is very common for reconstructions to have a significant percentage of original materials, but for the health and well-being of guests and staff to also meet code.
Thank you. Next up, we have market life seems pretty great. What was responsible for the change from local vendors in open markets 100 years ago to the supermarket system we use today?
How long do we have to answer that question?
Just a couple more minutes. This could be our last one.
So I'm going to delay the answers momentarily just to go back a little bit and show a pretty pictures. 1916 is the first self-service supermarket, reputedly, the Piggly Wiggly in Memphis, Tennessee. But so that was a closed space where customers would walk in and everything was stocked on the shelves, and you could actually take something off the shelf and put it in your cart or hand basket and walk up and be checked out. That's what I think of as a supermarket. I think of the vegetable building as a bit of a supermarket too, because all those vendors were there with all the things that you would need, fresh fruits, meats, vegetables, and sometimes supplies. And you would walk to wherever the person was and you knew exactly where they were, right? So you always knew, in other words, the oatmeal is going to be in aisle 8 because the fishmongers are going to be on the north side outside wall. And the best melons are going to be in stall 42. I'm making some of this up, but you get the drift. So it was in fact going into a large, almost football field size space and going to the places where you knew you needed to get what you needed. You'd pay right there instead of at one location, cash register. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah.
Thank you. Yes, that is so fantastic. And we're just about at our 1 hour time. So at this point, we'll wrap it up. Of course, if you have any more questions, contact us on social media or through our website or our contact center. If you have membership questions, of course, you can always email membership@thehenryford.org. And so thank you again to Deb for all this wonderful information. And thank you again to our members for joining the program today and for continuing to support the Henry Ford. And so with that, we're finished for today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you all.